just might get everybody to take a seat, please. How's the volume on that up the back there? We good? Excellent.
I'll sit next to Lindsay.
Well, what a fabulous turnout. Thank you everybody for coming along tonight. Can I please start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we live and pay my respects to our elders past, present and emerging. We're very fortunate here in this country to have two of the world's oldest living cultures in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Can I also please acknowledge my parliamentary colleague here, Don Brown, who with me has helped put this great night together. Can I acknowledge Dr Nikola Stepanov, the Integrity Commissioner, Mr McSporran, Chair of the CCC, and Runnymeade, Executive Director from the Department of Local Government. Thank you for being here tonight. Many people have asked why do we put this night together, and when I was talking to Don, as a newly elected Member of Parliament, you go through an induction process, and I learned a lot in those few weeks in that induction process, and part of that was having presentations from both the Integrity Commissioner and the Chair of the CCC, and I found them to be really informative and set the framework for understanding how that moved forward. And as a result of that, I remember on the day of getting those presentations, I spoke to Nikola and said, these would be fantastic presentations to bring out into our community. Would you consider coming out to the Redlands? And she did, and also encouraged Mr McSporran to come and join us as well, which is fantastic. So it is a delight to have them both here to help, I think, set a good framework for what good governance looks like, what you should expect from your elected representatives, both in terms of integrity and accountability. So the toilets are just out in the foyer, out here. That way. Emergency exits as signed at the back here, and out through the front foyer. The format for tonight is Dr Stepanov, the Integrity Commissioner, is going to kick off proceedings tonight, and then it's going to be followed up by Mr McSporran, the Chair of the CCC, and then we're going to have a question and answer session that should take us through to about 7:30. So I might start with a little bit of background. So Dr Stepanov in 2017 was appointed Queensland's 5th Integrity Commissioner. She spent much of her career in service to the public sector and community. Her background is in research and research regulation, dispute resolution and mediation, and board and corporate governance. She has particular expertise in resolving complex and contentious conflicts where there are grave personal governance, reputational, financial risks. We all need to have a Nikola on board. She holds several degrees, including a Juris Doctor and a Doctor of completed in the fields of paediatric medicine, in philosophy from the University of Melbourne, which she completed in the fields of paediatric medicine, professional ethics and human rights, humanitarian law at the School of Global and Population Health at the Melbourne Medical School. Her professional accreditation and membership includes as a fellow member of the Governance Institute of Australia, accreditation as a mediator under the National Mediator Accreditation System, accreditation by the Federal Attorney General's Department as a family dispute resolution practitioner, and registration as a professional member of the Resolution Institute. In the mediation space, she has a strong interest in children's rights, elder advocacy, cross-jurisdictional property matters and cross-border treaty matters. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce you to Dr Stepanov, who's going to talk us through integrity.
I think I have to stay behind the lectern. Sorry, I normally kind of wander about the room. Yeah. Oh, actually, it's a good idea. Feels like a karaoke machine. What Kim didn't mention is that I did my presentation first for their parliamentary induction, and then Alan came along the second day. They should keep me very busy, otherwise I'd be hitting the Chardonnay. Isn't that right, Alan?
Just tell you the truth.
I'm not much of a drinker, but if I do drink as a Russian, it would likely be vodka or whiskey. So I'm the Integrity Commissioner. I'm the 5th one in Queensland. It hates me. It's a sign from another planet. It's Mars. has to be very close, doesn't it? All right, it's like an ice cream. Let me get this bit started. Oops. Never work with small children, animals, IT, people, microphones, what else? Hair dryers. I don't think it's going to sort itself out.
It's half cooking.
We'll have a brief pause. I might as well just start and tell you a little bit about what I do. So I'm the 5th Commissioner. The first Commissioner was actually a retired judge, and the second Commissioner was Gary Crook, who was Senior Legal Counsel for the Fitzgerald Inquiry. Is anyone as old or older than me and they remember the Fitzgerald Inquiry? Yes, that's right. Alan was young at that time, so he doesn't remember it. He didn't put his hand up, or he doesn't want to break some sort of secrecy provisions. So I'm number 5, so if anyone doesn't realise, I'm actually the first female Commissioner, so that's been quite unusual. And I'm also quite young to be a Commissioner. So under our Act, the Act that I administer is called the Integrity Act. So I'm a statutory office holder, I'm not employed by government. My reporting relationship is to the Speaker of the House and also to the Economic and Governance Committee, which is a parliamentary committee. I'm independent and impartial, and if you ever hear me speak, you will know it's rather frank and fearless. And so the purpose of having independent agencies such as mine is that so that you can feel that you can speak on matters without fear of any retribution. I'm also the convener and the chair of what's called the Integrity Committee. So that started back in 2001. The first Commissioner convened that. Joining me are the heads of some of the other integrity agencies, including Alan as the chair of the Crimes and Corruption Commission. We have the Auditor General, the Queensland Ombudsman, the Commissioner of the Public Service Commission, the Information Commissioner, the Electoral Commissioner and the Racing Integrity Commissioner. So it's about as many commissioners as you can get. I don't know that there's a plural for commissioner. It's not like a parliament of commissioners, a murder of commissioners, perhaps? Anyway, I'll leave you to think of a few other things that you can describe us as. So under the Act, I only have 4 functions. So 2 relate to advice. I also regulate all lobbying in the state of Queensland, and my office also does things like this. So part of my job is to raise awareness about integrity in public office. So with our public awareness function, we tend to take an integrated approach. So we're possibly trying to involve the other agencies so that instead of just getting one of us to talk about our approach, you often get a couple of us. So it's always nice when Alan and I sort of tag team to something together. We do a lot of workshops and seminars throughout government and also through schools, all those kinds of things. Our highlight of our financial year last year was we spent a day at Live Fire with QFES, which is the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services. So this is my office, me, and the office staff in full gear. It was about how hot was it that day? I think it was like 42 degrees, and this was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I think we all lost about 18 kilos by the end of the day. I'm the 3rd one along, so if you see me, I would have actually been smiling, but I would have been sweating quite profusely. I also do things like review policies, processes, etc., and also parliamentary submissions. Will it let me use it now or not? Am I allowed? So under the advice functions, I've actually got a huge range of clients that can seek advice from me. So under the Act, they're called designated persons, and it includes all ministers and members of Parliament, all statutory office holders. So you may not realise, but in Queensland we have about 1,800 statutory office holders. So that's all the people on Queensland boards, all the other commissioners, ombudsmen, etc. So it's a huge amount. All the ministerial staff, all of the directors general or equivalent, all chief executives, all senior office holders. And under the Act, the ministers have the discretion to nominate any person or class of persons that they also think should fall under the Act. So in February of this year, Minister Hinchliffe nominated all mayors and councillors. So that's how I ended up becoming their advisor as well. So under the Integrity Act, there are certain protections that are afforded to people that come forward when there is uncertainty and they seek advice, and they put my advice into effect. So if they provide me with all the information that I need and they put my advice into effect, they're actually protected from civil liability, and they're also protected as part of any administrative review process. However, it doesn't have any impact on criminal law, so that's something to remember. And it doesn't impact on any liability they have before they come through our door. In return, oh look, I did it. Oh no, you did it. Hang on, we'll get there. It's like one of those old movies, you know, you roll it down. So we have very, very tight secrecy provisions under the Act. So we're bound by confidentiality provisions. For us, all my staff, and I've got Susan and Laura here tonight, you might like to say hello to those. Don't be shy, you can always put your hand up, ladies. So my staff and I are not able to breach those provisions, or it's off to jail we go for a year, or we might get 85 penalty points, which is actually worth quite a lot of money per breach. As well, because of those secrecy provisions, the staff and I cannot be compelled in any proceedings, so it's actually very, very strict secrecy. So you might hear sometimes about the Integrity Commissioner saying something or not. We can't weigh in on that, so we can't refute a claim, etc. We can comment generally about integrity issues, but I can't comment on any particular matter. So everything we do in our office is focused on this. So although I'm an advisor to a lot of people, any advice I provide to them has to resolve the matter in the public's interest. That's your interest. It's not in the person's own interest. So it's very different from, say, if you go and see a legal advisor or some other advisor, they'll provide you with advice that's in your own interest. That's not what we do. Ours is always in the public's interest, and that's how we resolve it. So the primacy of the public's interest is paramount, and that's the first thing on our mind always. It does result in us providing advice to our clients that will be detrimental to their interests, because usually they have to give something up or stop doing something. So when they come through our door, they do expect to go away with some advice that they might not like. And that's what happens when we try and resolve things in the public's interest. So the test that we use is very objective, and it's based on the reasonable person fully informed. So essentially the reasonable person fully informed is an ordinary member of the community with all the facts that I have in front of me, so that's the standard that we use. We do have those confidentiality provisions, and there's a reason for that. And that is that when people are facing uncertainty, we don't want them to sort out things on their own. We want them to actually come and seek advice from an independent agency, and that's why we have those protective provisions that are extended to them. So as I said before, often our advice will cause some detriment to them, whether they have to sell shares at a loss, or in some cases a spouse might have to give up a particular type of work that they're doing, or we send them out of a room so they can't take part in a particular decision, even if they've got a strong interest in that decision. Oh, do we both do it then? Oh, we will get this right by the end, and then it'll be Alan's turn. Okay, you go, not me. I think that's the wrong way. But it's good because we're acknowledging the primacy of the public interest. It popped back up again. Let's never miss an opportunity. All right, so I started 1st of July last year, and previously the commissioners were doing about 50 to sort of 60 pieces of advice a year, and it had been that since the beginning of time, since the beginning of Integrity Commissioners. Something happened when I started and it went crazy. So initially I had a 3-fold increase from July to February. I think they were trying to make me work harder. And then when mayors and councillors were added to the mix, it went out even further. So in the month of July we had 51 requests, which was the usual annual amount. So, sorry, not for June, I should say. I'm so tired, I'm just getting my months confused. What was that, sorry? The prediction for this financial year is 300 to 600. We can't actually predict it. We've got a few amendments coming through and various act changes. So the best we can say is our low point will be 300.
We've got the same stuff, we just work harder, we think faster, and we've introduced some models that we can use within the office so that we can churn our advice out much, much quicker. Part of the reason that we are so busy is, one, we do a lot more in the public space, but then the second thing is the community has higher expectations of public officials and public servants. So there's a heightened expectation, a heightened ethical awareness. So it's actually a really, really great time to be heading an integrity agency, because essentially we're seeing that just a huge change coming through. So it's kind of like riding a wave. It did feel when it was very busy that we had been sort of swamped by the wave. I think our favourite saying comes from Susan, and that is that we felt like we were holding back the tide with a pitchfork. But we've managed to stay ahead, so we're very, very pleased. So if you have a look at who we're providing advice to, in the first 3 quarters of the financial year, we had a lot of members of parliament and a lot of statutory office holders. As I said before, there's lots of statutory office holders. But then in that last quarter, we had a complete flip, and now 75% of our advices will involve mayors and councillors. So there are 579 mayors and councillors, so we already had 5,000 people that fell under the Act, and then it added sort of an extra 579. So that has kept us very busy, and we are earning our keep. So the main things that we see, this is some sort of key highlights from international data. I tend to refer a lot to things like the data coming out from Transparency International, KPMG, all those kinds of things. They do some brilliant reports. So we find that the most common issue for corruption and misconduct is undisclosed conflicts of interest, and that really makes up the bulk of our work. The most crucial component to prevent corruption and also misconduct is the tone at the top, so the culture. It's really, really difficult if you've got issues with the culture at the top to be someone from below trying to change things, because you often feel quite powerless and quite helpless. For us, the doctrine of public trust takes precedence, so we're always out there saying your public responsibilities take precedence over your private interests. That's what you sign up for. You only put yourself forward for, whether it's Alan's job, my job, a councillor job, an MP's job. You only do that if you know that you're going to act in the public interest. Otherwise, you are not a suitable person for the role. So we always say that public officials must always promote confidence in the public sector, and they should always be out there talking about the primacy of the public interest. So a common advice concern, so this is kind of giving you a little bit of a breakdown of the day-to-day stuff that we see. What we cover is really, really, really diverse. So you wouldn't see it if say, for example, you worked in a law firm, you normally specialise in one area or another, or accounting. We don't do that. We're literally across the board. So the main things involve things like shareholdings and property ownership. We often have competing statutory obligations, so that's where we've got statutory office holders that hold 2 positions. The acceptance of donations, hospitality gives some benefits, so we spend a lot of time thinking about what people are eating and what kind of gifts they're getting. Potential conflicts of interest that arise as a result of relatives and friends. This is more complex. It looks like such a simple sentence, but it's more complex in the modern age because we have different understanding of relationships. We've got people separating, we've got estranged adult children, all those kinds of things. So we're sort of dealing with it and creating a new framework. We've got lots of potential conflicts of interest arising from employment. Post-separation issues, so there are quarantine periods when you leave very senior government posts. So we impose quarantine periods where they're not able to have business dealings with government. And we have a lot of questions about the rights of whether it's a councillor or a minister or an MP as an ordinary member of the community versus their obligations, because at some point their jobs stop and their lives start. And it can be a very blurry line. So in terms of preventing misconduct and corruption, it requires quite a lot of things. And it effectively means you have to always put your own interests last if you choose to take up these positions. And it is a choice to take up these kinds of positions. It requires a commitment and vigilance. It requires honourable conduct and personal integrity. It requires an awareness of your responsibilities, and that's something we do see. spend a lot of time doing education, making sure people are aware of their responsibilities, including any obligations that they have under codes and standards. It requires an environment of openness. So if you feel that people, if you're going to be persecuted or embarrassed or in shame, you're less likely to come forward if you are facing an uncertainty. So we're trying to get the idea of a conflict of interest as a negative thing out from wherever it's the paradigm that it sits in now. Does anyone here not have any interests? No one loves you, you don't love anybody, you have no stuff, you're not a member of anything? That's right. So it's perfectly natural that a conflict of interest should arise at some point, don't you think? But sometimes it's used in such a way against other people that it looks like it's a character flaw of some type, and we need to get rid of that. So we want to dispel a few myths tonight as well. These are my favourite ones that I see. Do you want me to do it? Oh, I can do it. Couldn't decide then, there we go. Should we turn it in the public's interest? Is it the public's interest we pressed it up? All right, so these are the common things that I see, and it's often what's said to me. I'll meet with the group and they'll say integrity issues are black and white. It's all about common sense. Apparently we all have common sense all of the time. We're very objective, even in things that involve us and might impact on us. We're able to recognise our own interest in a situation, and we can still make a decision that's contrary to our interests, apparently. The personal interest we have in others is not going to stop, it's not going to get in the way of any of our decisions. So these are some of the myths we hold, and even I have some of those myths, especially when I'm near a shoe shop. I always think, I can be objective in this shoe shop. I must have those shoes, I can be objective. We always think as individuals that we know what our community want or needs, and normally it's an idea that we have. We'll be passionate, we'll hold that ideal very strongly, and we'll say the community needs this, even though it might not be a view that's widely shared among the community. And we often come up with things like, I've got a better understanding of the situation, or I know more about this, and then we'll insert some kind of justification behind it. So when I'm dealing with my clients and when my team are dealing with our clients, we explore some of those things. So when they come in and they say, but this is what the community wants, we start asking some questions and we're looking for the hard data. So tell me how you know that that's what the community wants. Tell me why you're wedded to this idea. And sometimes you find that it's just that unconscious bias. They've got this strong interest. They think their version is right and other people might be wrong. And they're pushing this version forward. But that's really about imposing your will on someone else. So we've got to be really careful about that. And that last one, we've got to get around this idea that having a conflict of an interest is a bad thing. It's actually a really bad thing if you don't recognise it. You don't seek advice from someone independent about how to manage it. That's what's called a bad thing. But actually having a conflict of interest, it just means you like people and you have stuff and you have an interest in the community and the things that you're doing. Thank you.
This one will work on the clicker, it's a PowerPoint. We had it down pat, Alan.
I know, I've mucked it up for you. Okay, well, I have to say something before I begin, and that is that, well, firstly, thank you for the invitation to Kim and Don to come and speak. I do a bit of this because I think, although we are a law enforcement agency, I think our critically important role at the CCC is actually one of corruption prevention. And part of that involves these sorts of presentations where we hope, at least, this performs an educative role, similarly to the way that Nikola does when she does these tours as well. So the message really is that there are things that you need to know to recognise as corruption risks and put in place things to mitigate the risk and deal with it, rather than once it occurs, coming to us or the police and leaving it to us to clean the mess up, whether it be a criminal charge, a dismissible disciplinary breach, or something as serious as that. It's far more sustainable to identify and prevent that sort of misbehaviour rather than let it get out of control. And it makes perfect sense when you think about it from a economically sustainable viewpoint. The second thing I need to say is that what I'm going to be talking about community expectations and giving examples of what they are and how they might be breached, I'm talking at a very high level. You shouldn't think that I'm talking about any individual or any group of individuals, or in particular any council. You'd understand from the media in recent times that there's been a lot of activity in the local government sector. There's been some serious alleged corrupt conduct that we've uncovered. Criminal charges have been laid, and those investigations into various councils is ongoing. I'm not talking about that. What I'm referring to is generalities. I'm going to talk about examples, not naming people or councils or any individuals, as I say. And you shouldn't draw those conclusions. People are before the court. Our job in that sense is done. What the court does with it, what a jury might do with it, a magistrate might do with those cases, is largely irrelevant to us, other than being curious about the end result of work that we've carried out. But that's the advantage, if you like, and the necessary framework that centres around a separation from the investigator, which the CCC falls into as a category, and the judicial arm, which decides those issues quite independently. We decide to charge someone, we put them before the court. If it's indictable, the Director of Public Prosecutions has control of it and prosecutes it. If he or she thinks that there is no reasonable prospect of success, or the evidence is insufficient, and in effect disagrees with our assessment, that's their call, not ours. So we have no control over that. We might be consulted for as a courtesy, but we have no decision-making role in that process. And that's exactly how it should be. There's got to be a separation between the policeman and the prosecutor. So bear all that in mind, and bear that in mind when you're asking me questions. I can't talk about individual cases. Not because I'm being sneaky about it or trying to maintain secrecy, it's just the process. It'd be quite unfair of me to start talking about individual cases before the court, because that's not our function, it's not your function, but you end up on the jury at some point. So we need to stay away from that, so we make sure that those people, whatever they've done or haven't done, get a fair trial, and the result is fair to them and you, the community, and us as the investigators. So the first thing I want to do is talk about this. I'm introducing this presentation with this slide for this reason. It's important to understand in local government that local governments, that is the councils, are charged with the good rule and local government of their area. In your case, that's the Redlands area. The local government, and that's in the Constitution of Queensland Act itself, as we say there in Section 7. The Local Government Act of 2009 makes it clear that each council, as a body politic, as an entity, is the elected body responsible for the good rule and government of their local area. And that, as you see, is Section 8 of that Act. By Section 12, sub 3, sub D of the same Act, all councillors are responsible for being accountable to the community for the local government's performance. Now that has some significance, because it's not a case where, as a member of a council, you can say, oh look, I didn't know that my fellow councillor was misbehaving. I had no idea that he or she were up to that sort of conduct, so it's not my fault. I'm completely innocent and I've done nothing wrong. You have individually and collectively, thanks, Tim, responsibility as councillors to promote the values of transparency, accountability and good governance across the organisation, which in the case we're talking about is the council. And if you think about that for a moment, if each councillor has that responsibility globally and takes it seriously, corruption and misconduct cannot thrive, cannot continue. Because ultimately it will be discovered, it will be found out, it will be pulled out, reported and dealt with if it's not noticed as soon as it happens. Now that's the foundation, the fundamental plank in this whole local government sector. Starts with the Constitution, it's reinforced by the Local Government Act itself, and at the end of the day, the Minister and the Department also have responsibility to make sure that there is ongoing public confidence in the local government sector as a whole. If there's a failure of public confidence, for whatever reason, it doesn't matter why, if there's a failure of public confidence, it has to be addressed. Because you, as the community, who exercise your democratic right to vote in individual councillors to represent you, you place your trust in them to do the job for you and look after you as individuals and as a community. They have an ongoing responsibility to maintain that and to maintain your confidence and trust in them. Now, if for whatever reason that fails, that is a significant failure in transparency, accountability and good governance, which has to be addressed. So what is, to come to the core of what this is all about, what is, or what do we think are the community expectations of elected representatives? What do you expect of people you vote in to represent you in your local councils? I'm going to go through these individually shortly in the coming slides, but this is a summary of them. Power and influence you expect will not be improperly used for personal benefit or benefit or detriment of another. So you'd be expecting your councillors, people you've placed your trust in, to always exercise the power that they have in that role, and it's considerable, as you know, under the Local Government Act. You'd expect them to always exercise that power in the public interest, and as Dr. Stepanov said, the last thing you'd be expecting or wanting will be for them to act in their own interests, potentially, almost inevitably, to the detriment of your interests as the people who voted them in. Or have them act to the detriment of someone else for a personal reason, not connected with the public interest. Now these things are, we know, obvious, but I can assure you this sort of misbehaviour goes on. Now, I'm not talking about individuals now, but I can tell you all of these things I'm talking about are evidence-based, and you wouldn't be surprised to hear that, I'm sure. This sort of misbehaviour occurs. People do breach the trust that you place in them as, and again I'll say you, I'm not talking about this community, you in the general sense of voters, people do breach that trust in these ways. There should obviously be oversight, appropriate oversight and accountability for expenditure and use of public resources. That's what you'd expect. If they're going to be spending ratepayer, your money, you expect there to be proper oversight and accountability of that process. You'd expect that there to be the relationship between council and councillors and the private sector, in particular, property developers and other recipients of council contracts, to be professional, appropriate and suitably monitored, so that everyone can understand transparently that it is an appropriate professional relationship. That there's no personal favour being done, there's no greasing of the wheels, there's no facilitation of a development application for a undisclosed personal gift or benefit. Again, those things happen. You wouldn't be surprised to hear. Next, steps that have to be taken to ensure transparency of council action and decision making, and And any mechanism that's identified that seems to be designed to avoid scrutiny must be reported and dealt with. I'll come to examples of how that might happen, but what you need to know is that the actions of your councillors and council collectively will withstand scrutiny. That what they do is transparently in your interests, the public interest more generally, and not for some other nefarious, personal, private motive. And you need to be able to determine that openly. And there shouldn't be any attempt to hide the way they operate from you, because you need to know, to have confidence in them as your councillors. So councillors themselves, executive officers and staff of the council must be encouraged to report observed or suspected corrupt conduct or misconduct. And those who do report have to be encouraged to do so and protected against reprisal action that might be taken for having disclosed misconduct. You know, there is the Public Interest Disclosure Act, it used to be called the Whistleblowers Protection Act years ago, and people still refer to people who report misconduct and corrupt conduct as whistleblowers. They're now, under the new Act, Public Interest Disclosures. The principles are the same, you understand the concept. And there's a whole regime in there, firstly to properly identify who is a PID, Public Interest Disclosure, or whistleblower, and if they aren't properly categorised in that way, how they should be protected. And I can tell you, and it wouldn't be a surprise to you, that's a highly controversial and problematic area. In your community here, you're a reasonably large community, although it's small enough that where you can understand what most people in your community are up to. You either know them or know of them, perhaps. The smaller the community, the harder it is to protect people who might be reporting misconduct, because everyone can work out who it is. So you might think, look, I'm terrified of reporting it because if I do, I'm going to lose my job, or at the very least I'll be subject to bullying, harassment, denigration, and ultimately some form of reprisal action. You can understand this is a particular problem you would be surprised to hear in the Indigenous remote communities that I visit regularly, because they have an extended meaning for what they do a family, that they're so small, those communities, and so isolated, everyone does know everyone and everyone's business. So if something is happening and needs to be reported, and the person wants to report it anonymously and have it dealt with and get protection, it is almost impossible to achieve that. That's not the fault of the person who wants to report it. They're doing exactly the right thing. It's our fault as a community for not devising a way that they can be properly protected. But it is a problem in all communities, but the smaller ones have that particular aspect to it that is problematic. But there has to be a culture, as you just heard, of encouragement to report misbehaviour, corrupt conduct, and protection of those people. And of course, the last point here is again the obvious one. You need to have in place an internal, you'd expect to have in place an internal, robust audit process. So you have someone within the council, internal auditor, whose job it is to run his or her eye over all of the things go on in council to see whether there are things that should be tidied up. Are they mistakes? Is it an example of corruption or misconduct, or just a simple mistake? If it's the latter, how might it be corrected? If it's the former, it should be reported up the line and ultimately perhaps to us or the police and dealt with. And how can the internal audit process be strengthened to make sure that that is identified more readily next time if it happens? So you might get the idea that all of these things are obviously things you would expect to have going on as a reasonable, fundamentally appropriate standard of conduct for your elected representatives. I'll take you to the first one, power and influence. One of the things you might think is necessary here is a training for staff, so they know when they're the subject of improper or inappropriate influence. Now, one of the examples I quote here, and again, it's a generic high-level example, but it's an obvious one when you think about it. There was evidence to our Belcara inquiry that looked into the conduct and behaviour that took place in respect of the last council elections in 2016, in respect of those 4 councils, Ipswich, Moreton Bay, Gold Coast and Logan. And there was evidence there, I'm not sure what happens at Redlands, but in those evidence for those councils that almost always, well, by far the greater majority, was over 90%, might have been 98, someone said 99%, of development applications are not decided by councillors. And the evidence was given to say, well, look, there's nothing to see here, the councillors have nothing to do with it. So we can't be corrupted. We don't do those decisions. What it doesn't take into account is this. The councillor, who might have an interest, might have a friendly developer who's been bobbing him or her, there is a committee that makes the decision of staff members, not councillors at all, as we heard in the Belcara hearings. The councillor who's got that interest and connection to the developer goes in to see the staff members, perhaps separately, perhaps collectively, but the purpose is to exert influence. They go and say, listen, we know that you have to make the decision independently. We're not trying to take away that right of yours. That's your job. We know you'll do it well and independently of us. But I can just tell you, Bob's a great bloke. He's got the interest of your community, our council area at heart. Now, as I say, I know you'll do your job, and I know you'll do what's best for the council and the council area. I can assure you, he's up for it, Bob. He knows what's right for this area. And then, having said that, they breeze off with a smile on the wave, leaving it to them, the staff members, to make that all-important decision. Now, believe it or not, some of those staff members, there's a number of aspects to this. They might not realise there's been an attempt to improperly influence them. They might think, well, that's just a friendly conversation. And after all, the councillor did tell us it's our job, not theirs. So he's reinforcing the independence of this process. But at the end of the day, that is an improper attempt to influence. And you need to have staff trained to state the obvious and understand that that is an improper attempt. And if an attempt like that is made, they need to call it out. And be encouraged to do so, and if they do, to be protected in doing so. I know that sounds fairly obvious and fairly basic, but believe me, the other side of the coin is employees, staff members, who are simply too afraid to go against someone who makes that attempt. They get the message loud and clear. The subtext is, you better do what I'm suggesting you should do, or your life here might be short-lived, and if it's not, it'll be unpleasant. That's the subtext, we all know that. So they have to be told explicitly in their training, in their induction perhaps, as early as that they should look out for those sort of things. Don't just accept that the councillor's doing the right thing and not misbehaving, and that if it happens, you should report it. If it's an innocent mistake, there's no harm done, is there? If there is something afoot that shouldn't be, it needs to be dealt with, and you should be supported for having called it out. So the problem with that, of course, is the imbalance of power. You've got the councillors who have a significant influence and power, the staff member who's in a precarious position. And, recent events have shown that the person in the most precarious position in this scenario, not necessarily for development applications, but across the board in dealing between the community, administering the council and the councillors, including the mayors, is the CEO. Anecdotally, the evidence is that CEOs in councils have an average lifespan of about 2.5 or 6 years, well short of their contracted periods of employment. So they disappear off the radar bound by confidentiality agreements where they receive large payouts, in effect, to be quiet. And the reason they're bought off, I should say also, it's ratepayers' money that's being used. The reason they're bought off is because they are at loggerheads, for whatever reason, with the council and some of the councillors. Again, I'm not talking about individual cases, this is anecdotally, and there's some evidence about all this. And that is something that it seems to us, and I think the Minister's said publicly, it's something that needs to be looked at. There needs to be protection for staff of council for those very reasons. That they're the people who make the council operate, and they need to be protected. It's odd, really, that despite the role they play, the significant role they play, they're not protected like ordinary public servants are. You know, public servants are covered by indemnities for legal costs and so forth, if they're doing their job properly. Council staff aren't, and often they're not even covered by an insurance scheme. So they're particularly exposed, so that's something that needs to be addressed. So the next item is accountability. So there needs to be appropriate oversight and accountability of expenditure and use of public resources. So the need for new policies and procedures. The reason for that is that our experience has been doing various investigations, not just in council, but across the public sector. One of the things that my investigators used to say to me is, oh, this whole investigation has failed. We haven't charged anyone with a criminal offence. I said, well, why haven't you charged someone? Well, there were no sufficient policies and procedures in place at that department or that council that we could use as a benchmark for why there'd been a breach of it, which may have been dishonest, and hence criminal offence. So we simply couldn't prove it because they didn't have the policies and procedures in place. Now that's ironic, isn't it? The council escapes, or the public sector department escapes prosecution because they're so devious or slack, they didn't have a procedure for doing something, so you couldn't say they breached it. And you saw this recently, and this is publicly, we said this publicly. We're looking at how a person got appointed to a government board, you know, the fuffle around all that, involving Mark Bailey sending the CV and so forth. We said, look, it's an irregular process because there's no policy about how that selection should be carried out. It's totally at the Minister's discretion. Now, that might be a good thing, or it might not be. It's certainly not transparent. But it didn't become corrupt conduct because there's no benchmark. We couldn't say that appointing someone who hadn't even applied and whose CV was given after the cut-off date breached any procedure, because there was none. There was no procedure saying how it should have been done. And we've struck that time and time again. I don't quote that example to say it is corrupt. It would have been corrupt if they had a procedure. I'm just quoting it because it's a good example of there being no procedure in place. We strive it all the time. And I say to my people was, you haven't failed by not charging someone. What you need to do, and what we need to do is call it out, produce a public statement that says there was a lack of governance and transparency here, there was no procedure. So we simply couldn't get to the bottom of what they really were up to. And they need to put in place appropriate procedures for that purpose. So you have travel allowance claims are obvious ones. You know, you'd expect those to be very closely monitored for obvious reasons. If you're using a council car, you'd be expected to be using it for council purposes. You wouldn't want them to be using it for private purposes, away on weekends. You wouldn't want them to be doing that and to cover up that that was being done to fudge the record, the logbook, or the hours of the drivers, who was driving it, and so on. All of those things you'd expect to be tightly controlled. Often they're not. Often they're not. And it's a huge corruption risk that people can behave this way. Travel allowance claims where you have approval of the claim after the expense is incurred. That's very neat, isn't it? You know, you go and incur hundreds, if not thousands of dollars worth of expenses, come back and you say, I'd like that approved now. Well, what's going to happen there? They're going to say, no, you haven't got approval, and there's a huge bun fight about that. That's what should happen, obviously, but no, the easier way is to give it retrospective approval. And documentation might not be adequate, might not be correct, it could well be false. That's not something you'd expect of your elected officials to be going on. The other way is asking a friend in a business, interstate, to send you an email asking you to come down for business, to justify a private trip you've already booked and have in mind, and is paid for by council. You'd be horrified to learn any of your councillors were behaving that way. And if they were, you'd expect it to be called out and corrected. And of course, community donations. That comes back to the whole question of policies that have to be unambiguous, everyone understands them, and they're adhered to. When they're not, they're called out. Council and the private sector, I've spoken a bit about this already. The relationship between council and private sector, there's an inherent corruption risk in accepting donations from property developers. That's now unlawful under the Belcara reforms. But it applies across the board, not just to developers. And one thing that staff and councillors actually have to be aware of is that people who will benefit from council contracts, whether it be a development or something else, a procurement contract, an IT contract, whatever it is, they have to be aware of friendships with private sector people. It might be quite innocent. You know, you can't quarantine yourself entirely from friendships, and no one suggests you should. But you need to have your radar up. You know, people buying you coffees, that's how it usually starts. Or someone sidling up to you at the children's football game, introducing themselves, and then the relationship starts. You think it's all quite innocent? Believe me, this is exactly how some people operate. And some people are known to operate, some big companies are known to have a policy of operating this way. So your poor old council staff and your poor old councillors, if their radar's not up, you can find yourself in a position where you've developed this friendship, and you know the next step is you ask for a favour. It might be a very small favour, and human nature being what it is, you don't want to say no. You don't want to be rude. That's what human nature is, and that's what they play upon. So then the next favour is asked, and before you know where you are compromised. And then, what do? Then? You report it and risk losing your own job because you have been compromised, or do you try and cover it up and get on with it and hope it doesn't blow up in your face? So people need to be aware of that, and you'd expect them, as your elected representative, to be savvy enough to realise that's what goes on and to be aware of it and guard against it. And really, it even comes down to things like conflicts of interest, as you heard a moment ago. And I think that's a huge area that intrudes upon all of these things, really. To be able to recognise, as you heard, and it's correct, there's nothing wrong with having a conflict. It's how you manage it that is the issue. And I'll tell you more about that in a moment. The next one is transparency. Here the issue is, one of the issues is use of private emails. That's a huge corruption risk. You know, even if your reason as a councillor for using your private emails, you don't have access after hours, you are working after hours routinely. Well, that's an easy IT solution to fix. I have after hours access. We have a hugely secure system that used to be almost impossible to get into, but even then I had external access. So that's something you can be easily fixed with an IT solution. But even if it wasn't fixed and you were using a private email account to do council business in those circumstances from home or out of the town or into overseas, what you can do is send your private emails received and sent in that context to your official email account. So you then have a record of them, a transparent record in the council IT system. That's one way to protect yourself if you have a reason for using them in the first place. My counsel to you is those people would be not using them because it's a bad look. I mean, let's face it, if you've got a dedicated work email account, why would you be using a private email account? If you had an innocent explanation, it's still a very bad look. People automatically think you're trying to hide something. And why are you trying to hide something if you're above board? That's the risk you run if you end up. And look, Mark Bailey's in that position, isn't he? He's not corrupt. We've seen all the emails. We've said 100 times there's nothing in them. It's all banter. There's nothing corrupt about it at all. But people will not let go. The media have hounded him, and us for that matter, unfortunately, for 12 months about all of this. All because, as a minister, he was using a private email account. Just shows you the sort of trouble you can get into, and it's the same with any elected official. You have to be completely transparent. If you're conducting business, you shouldn't have anything to hide. Same with use of controlled entities, council companies, companies controlled by council. That's one way of sidestepping our jurisdiction because they're not public entities. Units of public administration is the definition in our Act goes. They also are not subject to the right to information laws, so it's another cute way of avoiding scrutiny. And there might be good reasons why you're using such an entity, but if so, you need to be more transparent about it, because otherwise you'll at least run into the problem of people thinking you're up to no good. And in some cases you are probably up to no good using those entities. Messaging applications, if you're a councillor, someone you've elected, why are they using encrypted messaging apps? Unless it's to avoid scrutiny of what they're talking about in the messages. Criminals do this routinely. It's a bane of our life. We used to be able to recover all of this stuff. Now it's encrypted by default, as opposed to the other way around. So people in council who are using those sort of methods of communication would, at the very least, create a perception that something's not right. And that needs to be reported and avoided. So culture, as you heard, culture is fundamentally important. There needs to be a culture, starting from the top, as you've heard, within council, to have openness, accountability, and of course integrity. Everything you do as a councillor needs to be done in public interest and transparency so. No attempt to hide things. Everything that you decide, or a committee of yours decides, needs to be on minuted and on the website, so that you, the community members, can look at and see what's been going on, how they've been performing, what they've decided, how they decided it more particularly. It's there for all to see. One council I won't name used to put their minutes of their meetings on the website, but there was no date and no index. So you just opened the web page and there was a huge volume of information. If you wanted to find out what they decided last week, you had to start trawling through, opening each of the links to find out which meeting was the one you were looking for. Now, I can tell you, and understandably, that created a very bad taste in the mouth for the community members who were trying their best to understand what the council was doing. That's a simple way you can be transparent. And as I say, whenever you're deciding, whenever councillors are deciding, you'd expect them to be upfront and declaring any conflicts of interest they have. So as we say, there's nothing wrong with having a conflict. Everyone has it if you're living your life normally. Everyone has conflicts, some more serious than others. The reforms that have been put in place after the Belcara hearing are designed to help councils and councillors be more open and transparent and come to the right decision when they meet as a group. So when you turn up for a council meeting, you've not only got an obligation yourself to declare any conflicts you have to your knowledge, but someone else who's at the meeting who knows something about your background and what business interest you might have, if they know that and think you have a conflict, they've got a duty to report it at that meeting. It might be something quite innocent you've forgotten about. It might be years ago. You've forgotten, but someone remembers and they bring it up. You say, oh, sorry, that's true. Then you debate it as a group, decide as a group. Helpfully, it's not designed to exclude people. If it is, if you're deliberately trying to exclude someone, that'll be corrupt conduct. That'll come to us. This is all designed to help the group get the right decision without having the decision tainted by someone voting when they had a conflict. Again, the evidence at Belcara from someone was that I've had a conflict, I've declared 20, 30 times, but in the public interest, I voted every time. And that council thought that was entirely appropriate. So look, I don't suggest the council was dishonest. I think that the councillor didn't understand the ramifications. She'd done the right thing by declaring it, but she should, in most of those cases, development applications I should say, in most of the, if not all of those cases, she should have stood aside. So that's in the public record, that was evidence given in public. And the example I quote about what happens with conflicts is people say, look, I know for a fact I've done nothing wrong, the council might say. All this nonsense about declaring it and having it debated and wasting time, it's just that. It's a shocking waste of time. I'd rather get on with the business so I know I've done nothing wrong. Well, there's nothing more certain to get you into trouble as a councillor than that attitude. What you should be thinking is, I know I've done nothing wrong, but if I just stand back for a moment, look at my conduct, the way I'm going to do this and have this transaction decided, what would someone who doesn't know me think about that process? Would it pass muster? An example I quote, this is a public one, the last election, Graham Quirk, the Mayor of Brisbane, was accused of being corrupt by the mayoral candidate for the opposition, Hardy was his name. He said the mayor was corrupt because he gave a favourable decision, a planning decision, recommending government give a huge block of land to a business owner who was a donor to the Liberal National Party, in other words, Graham Quirk's party. It came to us, it was made public, and then it comes to us to clean up the mess. This is days out from the election, so we're expected to drop everything and solve this problem. Just fortunately, we were able to solve it immediately. I want to say immediately, it took a bit of work, but at the end of the day, we said there was no corrupt conduct, but it was a well-grounded perception because there was nothing documented about how that decision was made. There was no proper process gone through that the committee, of which the mayor was a member, had made this decision. So he left himself open to that perception that he'd given it to a mate who was a donor to his supporting party. So we wrote and said, look, and we said this publicly in the press release, I think the statement we released, what should have happened was that committee, of which he was chair, should have said, look, this fellow who blogs has asked for that block of land for his business. He's a donor. We'll disclose immediately he's a donor to the party, but we administered this, but we can assure you that had nothing to do with the decision to give him, recommend the block to give it to him, because for these reasons documented, his price was the best price. It was lower than the previous offer by $500,000. He undertook to give us the money in cash within 2 weeks and so on and so forth. 5 or 6 good commercial reasons why he was the best candidate to get that block of land. Now, if that had been the case and that allegation was made, we could have said to him, did you minute this process? Yes, here they are. Here's the minutes. Thank you. Well, there's nothing in this. Goes away. Or he could have done it himself as soon as the person alleged he was corrupt. Because he hadn't, it dragged on. And just for instance, imagine if it had taken us a bit longer to solve that conundrum and he'd gone to the election without hanging over his head, which I'm sure the other side intended to happen. Well, that could well have been catastrophic for him. And it's just silly. So you need to have that change in mind. We wrote to him and said, look, you should have done these things to protect yourself. It's your best protection. Document these things. He wrote back unfortunately and said, thanks, but we're pretty right with what we've got ourselves already. So, in any event, if it happens again next time, we might be a bit slower in resolving the problem. So they're the sort of things we need to watch out for, and they're all obvious, but honestly, these things happen every day of the week, and they happen because people don't stand up and be counted and understand that these things have to be fixed. If it's not good enough, there might be small breaches, but that's the thin end of the wedge. So I'm going to take you to this one, and just remind you, as I said right at the start of this, that we are a corruption prevention agency, first and foremost. I take that role very seriously. I personally think it's our most critically important role in what we do. And our website, which is linked there, has a lot of resources. And you as community members or councillors, elected representatives of whatever kind, can go to that website and there's a lot of resources you might find useful and helpful to give you a clue as to things you should be looking out for where you might go, who you can go to report things, and how you might go about it. We have an online complaint service. We encourage you to do it confidentially. We respect that confidentiality, and it's important that we get things confidentially because then we can investigate them properly, assess them if necessary, investigate them. If it's out in the media before we get a hold of it, if there is something going on, the baddies have all that time to get their heads together, destroy evidence, change their stories. That's not ideal. We like to get it before the balloon goes up and we can have a close look at it. If we say there's nothing in it, you disagree, you go to the media and tell them how badly we handle it, and we'll have to wear that if we're wrong. But give us the first bite of the cherry, that's our job. We've got a whole lot of powers that we use to find out these things. And if you're still in doubt after the website, come to us. We're there to help you. Phone call, email, whatever you like, we're there to help you. So that's all right, thank you. I'm happy to.
Just before we do that, thank you. Just before we do that, so tonight, again, thank you, Dr. Stepanov and Alan MacSporran QC for coming out to Redlands and giving those presentations. I think it's valuable and vitally important to obviously get out on the ground and making sure that you're hearing from the people and also educating as well. So we're going to, the way we're going to do this, so it isn't sort of hijacked by any one particular person. We're putting around questions to put in the hat. We're going to randomly draw them out and allow our two guest speakers to answer those. So while we're doing that, I just wanted to give an update about, and we've got this from the two presentations about culture and what is coming from the top down. As you can see from them, both of the speakers, especially Mr McSporran, is that we cop a whack, Mr Bailey cops a whack, the other side cops a whack, and that's important. That's important that these guys have the independence to ensure that we are doing the proper job. We've ensured as a government that a culture of the top down, that we give more powers to the CCC and changes to legislation. We're going through, we've done the first, as Mr McSporran has alluded to, we have already implemented 3 of the recommendations out of the 31 recommendations, if I can recall off the top of my head. So we've done stage 1 of our CARA. There's more stages to come in legislation in that regard. We've opened up, obviously, the Integrity Commission to obviously play an important role with local councillors to ensure that they are getting the feedback and response about how they deal with conflicts of interest, as you see. So more powers through changes in the CCC legislation. We've done more transparent political donations. We've dropped the rate of donations to be declared to $1,000. It was up over 12 grand in the previous governments. Making sure real-time donations, so you can't, so a large donor couldn't donate before the election and then after you win, hello, yeah, I'm declaring it now, and you can forget about it for 3 years. Making sure that we've got real-time donations for that. We talked about the developer donations, banning those. We expanded it from the recommendations of the CCC to include us as state representatives as well, which I think is an important step. And one that makes me think as well, that the changes about, I suppose, where is donations coming from, how you disclose them, gifts, lunches, all that sort of stuff. It is important that if there is any doubt of conflict, that we are thinking about that and how it would read in the Courier Mail, and as Mr McSporran has said, how we deal with it now so we're not dealing with it and having a perceived conflict of interest into the future. So that's just a little bit of detail. There is more, obviously, stages of our CARA for us to introduce. On a federal level also, it's important that us as a Labor Party, we're taking forward a federal ICAC to the next election. If successful, we'll be implementing that. Again, a similar example of a no tendering process around the Great Barrier Reef, the $440 million. That might be all kosher, but there isn't a process beforehand. There wasn't a tendering process. So you could save yourself a whole lot of trouble if you do have those processes in place. And it's important that we have independent bodies like we do here, making sure that we're doing the right thing and bringing that integrity to the community, because confidence in the community means that we'll get better outcomes for our community. So are we ready? Questions? Yeah. You want to read the first one?
Did you?
Yes. Are we reading the names or just do the questions?
Just do the questions.
Okay.
So we've got quite a few questions here. The first one is, do right to information laws need to be reformed to increase transparency and to reduce corruption?
Do the right to information laws need to be enhanced to improve transparency? So my agency is not subject to RTI. So I don't really have a lot of dealings with RTI. It might be better.
I think they do. I think the spirit behind that legislation, in its former iteration and currently, is routinely not followed. I think there's too much of an attitude of comply with the strict requirements of the legislation before there's any give and take at all. And a lot of times, as you'd appreciate, when people start to dig in and insist on strict compliance before releasing documents, what's the first thing that comes into your mind as an ordinary citizen? Must have something to hide. And you know, I've seen many examples in the time I've been in this job where there is nothing to hide. There is no logical reason why you wouldn't just open the door and let them in. And really, the whole thing just blows over. Whereas journalists are routinely frustrated. In fact, there's a woman at Channel 7, I think Alison, forgive me, I can't get past, that might be Brown. Her whole job, she's the RTI person, and she loves it because that's her expertise, and it's a true expertise, believe me, to understand how to navigate those laws and to try and get the most out of the applications you make. Extraordinarily expensive, it's time consuming, and it's just difficult. And it shouldn't be. The whole purpose of that information was to allow government, or allow the community to transparently see what the government was up to. And it's not being honoured by any governments, really. And I think some councils are in the same boat. Now, that attitude could be all quite innocent. It could be just a bureaucrat saying, well, that's the way the law says it must be. But really, even if the law was saying that, and there is an argument that is the case, you should just open your doors, and if there's nothing to be worried about, commercial and confidence and so forth, you should just open your doors and let people see what's been going on. Because often that's your best defence. Well, yeah, I mean, that is a problem. I don't think there is any way, frankly, to get disclosure of decisions quickly, other than, as I say, with council work, if the decision's minuted properly and it's on the website, that's for your benefit, so you can get to see the decisions. You can ask, you can write to the relevant councillor or council and ask for details of the decision. You can turn up. I'm not sure whether here you're entitled to be present at meetings. That's another way to take part, be present while the debate's going on. Sometimes they have some parts in public session, some parts in private session, but that's one way. But it's probably beyond the scope of what we can talk about tonight, but I understand your concern about it, because delay is your worst enemy. By the time you find out often what the problem is moved on, and you can't unwind it. You know, classic thing of building approvals, I suppose. I had experienced personally where we objected while the building was going up. By the time council responded, the floor had gone up, and if they responded much earlier to our concerns, the problem could have been fixed very cheaply to the builder and to everyone, including the council, but it became, you couldn't unwind it, other than demolish the whole place. They weren't going to do that. So delay is an enemy of transparency, obviously, and it causes frustration. And again, it causes a perception that there must be something there because they're taking forever to tell us there's not.
That's the next question here. So this one is there any time frame to suggest for reporting an issue of the issue that is now in the past? So is there statutory limitations on it?
Not really, no. So it doesn't matter how much time passes, you can still go forward if you've got a concern. And as I'm sure as Alan would agree, it really doesn't matter. And I think one of the problems for most people is as time passes you lose your recollection of an event, and that's why all of the integrity agencies are heavily focused on making sure you keep, or councillors or MPs or whoever, keep appropriate documentation, because that's all you have to rely on. Memories, we know, are subject to not being as good as we all think they are.
No, it's absolutely right. The problem's a practical one, just the loss of evidence, the inability to find the evidence that will tell one way or the other. People dying, people not being able to be found who are relevant witnesses, they move interstate, they move overseas, no forwarding address, it's just hard and often impossible, and that's a bad outcome. So the sooner it's reported and the fresher it is, the greater the opportunity to resolve it one way or the other.
A bit like my high school rugby career and the memories I have about that, I was a lot better than. The next one, are there some very well-known cases where the whistleblowers have suffered significant detriment? Sorry, the writings. And why should whistleblowers stand up, and how are they protected?
I think probably the most well-known one in Queensland involves Bundaberg Hospital, Patel, which was the person that went forward there originally because of they did not fall within the definition, ended up suffering significant detriment, apparently. Our agency is often involved as the first point of contact for persons in very high-profile positions, going forward with concerns about the conduct of others. It's not uncommon for them to arrive at us very distressed. They are always concerned about their own interests, but they're more concerned about meeting their obligations to the public. I think a lot of the problems that arise are due to people not being sure of the approach that they should take and who they should consult with about their concerns. By the time they reach us, they're often so distressed they've been living and fearing a particular situation for a very long time. So part of our role is we provide advice about heading them to the right agency or person to make sure that they are able to resolve the matter and to take the matter forward in the most appropriate manner. But it is a difficult situation, and it is not uncommon for me to draw their attention to the fact that it may be that they may suffer a detriment, but often they are obliged to go forward irrespective, but it's a very serious issue.
I agree with all of that. I think there's just one cautionary tale about all this, and that is that it's very easy to call someone a whistleblower. But under the Act, there's a very set criteria for how you qualify in that category, and it has to be a serious matter, and you have to have come to the authorities first. Now, there is a tendency, which defeats the purpose in many ways, of going to the media, having these things splash all over the paper, and they're forever called a whistleblower, and often they're not. Often they have their own agenda. Now, I'm not talking generally about whistleblowers. The greater majority of whom are well-intentioned and, as Dr. Stepanov says, put upon and suffer significant consequences. But there's a small group of people who like to characterise themselves that way for their own reasons and create maximum disruption. And it's often very hard for anyone else to unwind that process and paint the true picture, which is that they aren't really a whistleblower at all. They've had this other motive that's all self-interest. So, subject to that cautionary tale, I agree entirely with everything that Dr. Stepanov has said.
Thank
Just
you.
before you ask that, we're meant to finish at 7:30, so there might be some people that need to leave. We've got some really great questions. Ms. Dunn has
You
got
guys
so
are right to
many.
stay for a little
Yeah,
bit
right
longer.
for another.
I don't think they can leave now because we've got really good questions. Isn't it influence?
Yeah, sorry, that's influence. Sorry. Thank you.
You
Thank
may
you.
choose to stay or not.
So this next question is probably for Mr McSporran. In the Belcara inquiry, your efforts seem to be frustrated by responses, but some witnesses clearly failed a test of probability. Is the criminal code beyond reasonable doubt appropriate for public officials, and a lesser test and lesser guilt needed?
No, I think in my previous life as a lawyer and in prosecuting and defending a lot of people who are charged with criminal offences, I'm a great believer in the standard of proof, presumption of innocence. If the evidence is there and people are charged, we always do an assessment. Firstly, whether there's sufficient evidence. It's called a prima facie case, which is whether there's evidence upon which a jury could, not would, convict on that material. That's the first test. The second test is, if that's so, is it in the public interest and is there a reasonable prospect that a jury or a magistrate would convict that person on that evidence? So we do that assessment as well. And then we charge and put it before the court. At the end of the day, that is one protection that we should all have. That you shouldn't be convicted unless your guilt is established beyond reasonable doubt. Because the lower standard, which is called the balance of probability, so it's more probable than not that you're guilty, is not really adequate to deal with a criminal case. It's all right if you've got a dispute about an offence with your neighbour, or a personal injury case involving a car accident, or you fell over in Woolies on a slippery floor, then you've got to prove on the balance of probability, it's more probable than not that the car driver, Woolworths, is negligent. But where you're charged with a serious criminal matter, and bear in mind it might result in serious enough and you're going to jail, I think we'd all get comfort in the fact that there has to be proof by the prosecution beyond reasonable doubt. And look, judges have spent hundreds of years being told that you can't explain what beyond reasonable doubt means. The ordinary person, like yourselves, as jurors potentially, understand that. It's not an impossible standard, obviously, but it's a pretty high standard, and you all know what that is. You all know when you've got a doubt that's based in reason and common sense. You know, I fully support that. I don't think we should be watering that down in any format at all. Because if someone's done the wrong thing, you need to be able to prove it. Otherwise, they shouldn't have the potentially disastrous, serious consequences that flow from it.
Next question is, do you think the definition of corruption that regulates your investigation is too restrictive? I think this is for Mr McSporran.
I think that there's an argument both ways. Where there's an amendment in the pipeline that will make it a bit easier to investigate corrupt behaviour by being able to attack and investigate facilitators of it, even though they're not public officials. It's like someone who's outside the organisation, so he or she is a private contractor, but they're corrupt because they facilitated the corrupt transaction. So that's coming through. It'll be in the next Parliament or early next year, I think. That amendment's been approved. It's in the pipeline, subject to Parliament agreeing with it and passing it, but that's expected. But the argument of having a wider definition is that we would have more jurisdiction to look at things across the board. The problem with that is that we have finite resources and investigators to carry out these things. And our Act says that fundamentally we have an obligation to devolve investigations back to the public sector. That's our statutory duty. If we can, and they're capable of investigating it, it should go back to them. If it's more serious, or they don't have capability, and we need the extra powers that we exercise, we should hold ourselves. We do about 5% of all the stuff that comes in. If our jurisdiction was widened significantly, we'd need a lot more resources to do even 5%. And maybe that's not a good outcome. As it stands, it's a fine line between looking at all the less serious stuff and sending it back to the people who can deal with it, subject to our monitoring of it. We don't just send it back and let it go unless it's very trivial. We always keep an eye on it. And if it develops into something more serious, we have the right to take it back and do it ourselves, or certainly direct how it should be done. So I think that works fairly well, frankly. And unless there's evidence that comes out in coming years that says, look, there are things you're missing that you should be involved in, I don't think we can yet justify a much broader jurisdiction. I think the jurisdiction we have lets us get to see all the stuff we should be seeing, and more for that matter. So I'm reasonably happy with that balance at the moment.
There's some good doctor handwriting.
And this one's for Alan. It says, at the committee hearing you said you almost need someone on the inside to find the bodies. Do you feel people on the inside have enough protection should they come forward?
Well, I was speaking figuratively, I should say. But no, that's the fact. The plain fact is, in some ways it's a distressing fact, is that corruption, whilst it's a form of crime, it's a criminal offence most often, it is extremely hard to investigate. The offences that deal with what corrupt behaviour is are complex, they're difficult to prove, and unless you have someone on the inside, or someone who's so closely associated with it, that can give you the pointers as to where you should be looking, you could spend a long, long time and get nowhere. Frankly, if I could speak about Ipswich just for a moment, as you know, publicly, lots of complaints were made to us over many years. I've been there almost 3 years now. Long before I got there, there had been complaints about Ipswich and it had gone nowhere. Not because we weren't doing anything about it, because there simply wasn't sufficient evidence. We say that's changed, courts will decide whether we're right, but you need someone who can point you to where, otherwise you can spend a long time going in circles. If you get to start, powers that we have are fairly extraordinary, you know, coercive hearings, surveillance devices, telephone intercepts and so on and so forth. They're extraordinary because these things are hard to uncover. So you need extraordinary powers to be able to deal with them, and we use those powers routinely. But people who come forward are adequately protected. We take it very seriously. If they want to remain anonymous, what that might mean ultimately is we don't have them as a witness because they won't stand up. They'll give us the information, but they won't go to court for us. That might mean the prosecution goes nowhere, unless we can verify the information from another source, and we often can. But we absolutely respect your anonymity, and we protect you. We've got a witness protection program. We're unique in Australia that, unlike other states where the police force runs the witness protection program, we at the CCC, we operate the witness protection. If it's that serious and you're in fear of your life for good reason, we do a full assessment, you come into a witness protection program and you are physically and emotionally protected. So I think, as hard as it is, I encourage people to come forward because we think, on good reasons, that we can protect you. And you are doing a magnificent community service by blowing the whistle, as it were, and calling out this sort of behaviour, because no one should be subject to that sort of behaviour, and you don't deserve it as ratepayers and community members to have people behaving that way when you placed your trust in them. They've done quite the opposite and breached that trust.
Right, this one is about LGAQ. How effective will any measure put in place to enhance integrity be if the body training and influence such counsellors is not controlled in regards to integrity? I think we can probably both answer that. So LGAQ is the local government association of Queensland. It doesn't have a monopoly on education, so all of the integrity agencies and the local government department, we all run education programs for mayors and councillors. Often we run them together, or we run them, we'll attend LGAQ training seminars, and we talk about our different roles. In terms of standard setting and influence, so the different integrity agencies or anti-corruption agencies essentially set the standards. So we all have various acts. The Crimes and Corruption Act obviously sets the standards expected of counsellors for them. In terms of the advice we provide, we have particular standards. The Queensland Ombudsman, they have particular standards, and they also have an act. So the LGAQ provides education about those acts, but ultimately the standard setters are the different agencies themselves, and we also actively promote, and which is part of why we're here tonight, we actively promote our expectations and our roles to all menacing counsellors, as well as all MPs and others.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and it's important to remember they're not different standards that are set by the different integrity agencies. Now, we refer to things in common, such as the Public Sector Ethics Act, codes of conduct for public service. It's not rocket science, they're things that you'd expect there to be in there that are obvious. And they're the standards. If someone starts to talk about a different lower standard, your ears will be immediately pricking up, as they should. So all of these agencies, including the LGAQ, are on the same page as far as I can see about it. If they weren't, we'd be saying something about it, because it wouldn't be appropriate.
One more question? Yeah.
But before that, I was extremely remiss when I started in not acknowledging the great councillors that are in the room, and to also apologise on behalf of the Mayor that couldn't be here tonight. So we've had our Deputy Mayor, Lance Hill, and his wife Sheena. We've had Councillor Paul Golay, Councillor Wendy Bogai, who's our former Deputy Mayor, and also Tracy Hughes as an apology as well, with a terrible bout of the flu, and the man with the camera, Councillor Paul Bishop over here in the corner. So we've had a really great representation here tonight in councillors from Redlands City, so thank you for that. We're running well over time, so we're going to finish this off with a very last question, and this is to both of you. Do you have a simple working definition or guiding principle that guides the roles that you both undertake?
So my role is to resolve everything in the public interest. So ours is the primacy, it's all about primacy of public interest.
We have a similar role, really, but our access is something like our objective is to reduce crime and corruption in the public sector, which is obvious. I mean, we do both. Again, uniquely in the Australian context, we're the only agency like ours that does both crime and corruption. All the other ones only deal with corruption. And they have separate crime bodies, like New South Wales has the Crime Commission and has ICAC, they're separate crime and corruption divisions. All the others just have corruption, including the most recently formed one in the Northern Territory. So we do both, we do research, we do proceeds of crime, taking the money off the criminals and corrupt individuals, and we do witness protection, as I said. So we've got a whole host of businesses under the one roof. The guiding principle is to reduce crime and corruption in the for the benefit of the Queensland community.
Thank you very much. And can we give a round of applause for our two special guests? Coming over here to Redlands, we're very much appreciated for that. They've taken their time tonight to come out all this way. We better make sure that they get home. I don't know exactly where they live. I probably shouldn't know where they live, which is a good thing. But it is about making sure that we do things in the public interest. That should be first and foremost. That's the first and foremost in my mind, is the decision and the thing that I'm doing in the best interest for the people of Capalaba. First off, blatant and say always looking out for the people of Violet Electric first and foremost, and then obviously the people of Queensland. So again, I also like to thank everyone that took the time to come out tonight. I hope you take a lot away from this presentation tonight.
Thank you. And I've got the tricky electorate of Redlands, which sort of covers everybody, but it's a little bit different. The purpose of tonight was to elevate the conversation in our community around integrity, what you should expect from your local representatives. Thank you so much, Nikola and Alan. They were really informative presentations, and there were just so many questions. Thank you to everybody for coming. A little gift that you can declare It's from Delvine Delane. It's from Delvine Cockatoo Collins. As everybody knows, she's a wonderful Redlands artist that was showcased in the Commonwealth Games. Her design work is incredible. So we've got a small little gift to take away from the Redlands. So we've got Nikola the whale here, and then we've got the colours and ochres as well, and magnificent islands. So thank you very much again. Thank you very much everybody for attending. I hope that you took a lot away from that, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in our community about what you should expect from your local representatives and what good government at all levels looks like. So thank you.
One of them, but then that's you know, like, so in fact they can't protect the